half-brothers for 4,000 years, is destined to ignite the last war of the world, according to the Bible's prophets. Muhammad, a descendant of Ishmael, has brought over 1 billion people onto his side of this ancient conflict through the religion of Islam. From the time he started the Muslim religion, the dimensions of the conflict began to enlarge. So this is something that within the Christian world is often said that I'm embarrassed to tell you about, but it's out there and it's pretty widely held. And you don't have to look to the extremes of Hal Lindsey to find the sentiment. In the wake of 9/11, NBC, one of my favorite shows was The West Wing, and in the wake of 9/11 they had an episode called Isaac and Ishmael, and the show featured the White House staffers explaining to a group of high school kids why so many in the Arab world hate the United States. And at the end of the show, the First Lady character, the character playing the First Lady, came in and shared with them the story of Ishmael and Isaac, implying that the violence of 9/11 was an extension of an age-old conflict between these two characters who walk the pages of our scriptures. Well, I'm here to say that that connection is a fallacy. The connection that violence in the world between Muslims and Jews or Arabs and non-Arabs has been around since Isaac and Ishmael, it's a lie. It's not based at all on fact, and it's wrong historically, and it's wrong biblically. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about that. Historically, Isaac and Ishmael lived sometime in the 18th century BCE. You've got a timeline that is basically a timeline of Judaism, and you'll see it tracks what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Palestine and Syria and Mesopotamia, a timeline of the Hebrew Scriptures, what the Christians would call the Old Testament. And Abraham comes in there sometime between 1800 and 1700 BCE. So that's when he comes in. Ishmael is his firstborn, Isaac is second. Islam is born when Muhammad begins receiving revelations that would become the Quran, and that happens in 610 in the Common Era. So it's some 2,400 years later. So the concept that Muslims and Jews have been fighting since the days of Ishmael and Isaac is not true historically at all. And in the 1,400 years of Muslim history, there have been many more years of harmony and tolerance between Jews, Muslims, and Christians than raging conflicts. The wars that we've seen between Europeans and Arabs over the past 1,400 years have had much more to do with land grabs, with greed and guile, than with Isaac and Ishmael. And to say that these conflicts go back to Isaac and Ishmael is to believe a lie in the name of accepting as somehow historically inevitable the untenable realities of today's conflicts. History shows us that it does not have to be that way, and so does the Bible. So we'll turn now to our scriptures. We learn of Ishmael and Isaac through our respective scriptures, and they tell slightly different stories. The Quran only mentions Ishmael about 12 times in its thousands of verses. So the primary source that I'm using tonight is the story of Abraham's family from the book of Genesis. And the green sheet offers the passages that we'll be talking about tonight. I will not read them to you, and if you get bored, you're welcome to read them for yourself. I've tried to underline some of the key verses that we'll be talking about. As I was at my table, I believe within Islam, the stories of the Jewish Torah are referred to as the Tarat. Is that correct? And so, again, there are some differences in what we find in the stories between the Quran and the Tarat, or the Torah, or for Christians, the Old Testament, but many, many more similarities between the two. So that's what we're going to look at. According to Genesis 12, that's when the story begins, the story of Abraham begins. God promises Abraham that he will be made into a great nation, and that he would be blessed and that he would be a blessing. In fact, God tells Abraham that in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. And it's my understanding that Surah 2 of the Quran speaks of Abraham as a leader of humanity, and he surrenders to God, and as a result is blessed because of his faithfulness. According to Genesis 16, the next story, Abraham and Sarah have a little trouble getting pregnant. And so Sarah suggests that Abraham have a child with Hagar, who is a servant in their household. Abraham, we're told in Genesis 16, Abraham marries Hagar, and together they have Ishmael. And as you can imagine how this might work out, the book of Genesis is a wonderful soap opera, if you want to read it. Jealous about all this, Sarah treats Hagar harshly, and Hagar runs away. Hadrid in the Quran. But a messenger of God, an angel of God, meets her in the wilderness and calls her to go back, to return to Abraham's house, promising that her family would be, quote, so greatly multiplied that they cannot be numbered, a direct parallel to the promise of Abraham. So a similar promise is given to Hagar that is given to Abraham. And further, the angel says to her, now you have conceived and you shall bear a son, you shall call him Ishmael. God hears, for God has heard your affliction. So this is a pretty powerful passage in Hebrew Scripture of a direct encounter with God and a blessing that Hagar receives from God. And then the angel gives a prediction concerning Ishmael that's at the heart of our contemporary misunderstandings about the relationship between Isaac and Ishmael. The angel says that Ishmael shall be, quote, a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and that he shall live at odds with all his kin. That's the English translation, which is not very good. Calling Ishmael a wild ass of a man, that's pretty accurate to the Hebrew, but it speaks not to Ishmael's character, but to his lifestyle. It relates to his Bedouin ways, that they had donkeys who would carry the loads, and so the Bedouins were compared to donkeys. So that's not necessarily a derogatory term that shows up in Hebrew Scripture. And regarding his hand being against all, in Hebrew it literally reads, his hand in all, and the hand of all in him, and facing all his brothers he shall dwell. That would be the literal reading. Not his hand against all, but his hand in all. And this could be an idiom that indicates conflict. I had a conversation with a friend who is a rabbi, and I asked him about this, and he said, facing all his brothers he shall dwell, that could be interpreted like in English, the idiom, to be in people's faces. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can just be, he'll live facing all his brothers, which means he'll live in relationship with his brothers. I think that's an important difference that we see in that text. That Genesis 16 text goes on to say, you, Hagar, are El Roi, for Hagar said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? And all this unfolds at a place that comes to be called Bir Lahai Roi, which is translated the well of the living one who sees me. That's an important name, so when we get to the end of this little study, we'll come back to that Bir Lahai Roi. This also is incredibly significant. Hagar is one of the only characters, if not the only character in Scripture, who sees God and lives. And God, she is the only woman who God gives another name to. You are El Roi, the one who sees God. God sees me. That's a powerful passage that both Jewish and Christian traditions have pretty much ignored. And the Quran doesn't speak of much of Hagar or Sarah, either one. The women are not lifted up in that. So we keep on going in the story to Genesis 21, and that's when the promise to Abraham and Sarah is fulfilled. That's the third big block in your green sheet. Isaac is born. His name means laughter because Sarah laughed when she found out she was